Welcome to Risky Bitness, the channel that explores not only retro games, but also the hardware they run on. In each episode, I will break down a piece of system hardware and talk about how what's under the hood affects what's on the screen. I'll also discuss some trivia and a history behind the games and the systems that we're looking at, and then we'll take a look at some games to see what all that beautiful technology can do. We'll compare different ports and versions and talk about some hidden gems, as well as some ports and alternate versions of games that you may not know about. Thank you for joining us, and I hope you enjoy. This is our very first episode. I'm really excited. It's going to be a two-parter. We're talking about the Famicom Disk System. The Famicom Disk System was released in Japan in February 1986 as an add-on for the very popular Famicom. You may know it as the Nintendo Entertainment System. In addition to the ability to allow the Famicom to read floppy disks, the FDS also added an additional wavetable synth audio channel, resulting in richer music. So this is a really cool add-on for the Famicom in Japan. It only lasted for about 2 years. It was developed by Gunpei Yokoi, who was known for using outdated technology to try and make something out of it. One of the coolest things I've learned about in my quest for knowledge about retro games, I'm really excited to share it with you today. So there are two components to the disk system. There's the disk drive itself, and there's the RAM adapter. The disk drive sits under the Famicom unit, and the RAM adapter is seated into the cartridge slot. So for all intents and purposes, the Famicom Disk System is like a cartridge that you can swap games out on, which is really cool. And then, of course, that cartridge slot adapter connects via a serial cable to the disk system itself. So you've got the disk system, serial cable going into the RAM adapter, going into the cartridge slot. And that's how the disk system talks to the console. So really cool. Now, all that does is just read the disk and send the data back to the Famicom. The Famicom is still doing all the heavy lifting, so there's no additional processing power or memory coming from the disk system itself. That's all handled by the Famicom. All the disk system does is read the disk and send that information into the RAM that lives in the RAM adapter, which is then, of course, read by the Famicom. So there's very little hardware of its own apart from the memory and the RAM adapter. But that's actually a big disadvantage, and one of the reasons why the Famicom Disk System really didn't work out. Cartridge games are amazing in that they had very little limitation in how much memory you could actually fit on those cartridges. You could just keep on putting ROM chips on there. The biggest game ever on the Famicom was a megabyte. Now, a megabyte, if you're not too familiar with these terms and what they mean, a megabyte is 1,000 kilobytes. A kilobyte is 1,000 bytes. So we're talking about 1,000,000 bytes of data. Now, if we look at the disk system and the RAM adapter only had 128 kilobytes of RAM. So a little more than 10% of what the largest Famicom cartridge ever was. Now, most cartridges for the Famicom and the NES were using about 128 kilobytes, but there are many with less and there are many with more. And it could be expanded upon greatly. Now, I don't know, I couldn't find information on what the upper limit was for the Famicom, because the system board in the Famicom and the CPU were only going to be able to read up to a certain amount of memory, no matter what you did on the cartridge. So, I don't know what that limitation was, but we know it was definitely more than 1 megabyte. I would love to do a deep dive into the Famicom in another video. It's something that I definitely would love to explore. If you like this technical information and want to hear more of it, please let me know in the comments. It's definitely something that I want to make a central point for this channel and for every video, but I also don't want to spend too much time on it if it's going to detract from the video and make people not want to watch. So let me know what you think about that. And I want to do a little bit more talking about the technical aspects of the disk system as well. Now, the disk system did require its own AC adapter for power. So you have the disk system with its own AC adapter in addition to the Famicom AC adapter, which is a little clumsy, although not quite as clumsy as the Genesis CD32X debacle that we've seen, I'm sure a lot of other gaming channels talk about. Now, the FDS did have about 8 kilobytes of video memory, and again, video memory kind of think about it like if you know computers at all, your video card has video memory and then your system has system memory, and some of your graphics are handled by that video memory. Same kind of idea here. And again, kind of sky was the limit in terms of how much of that video memory you could have on a cartridge, but again, still limited by the actual capabilities of the system hardware. So just another very interesting piece of information there. Now the discs themselves, they're a modified version of a format called the Mitsumi Quick Disk. I looked into it, I tried to research it, I couldn't find a lot of information online about these Mitsumi Quick Disks. The only thing I found were a few ads where people were selling them, and they were selling them to be used with keyboards. I think like Roland keyboards. So I don't know how popular this particular format was. I don't know how prevalent it was outside of Japan. It may have been exclusive to Japan. It may have been international, but just used for MIDI keyboards, or it may have been bigger than that. I don't really know for sure. If you know a little bit more about the Mitsumi Quick Disk, please let me know in the comments. I would love to know all your knowledge about the Mitsumi Quick Disk and add it to another video. Of course, if you put that information out there for me in the comments section, I will definitely credit you for that when I mention it in another video. Now, the FDS discs were 3 inches, so these quick discs were 3 inches. Now, if you remember at all, the floppy disks from back in the day, if you're as old as I am, then you probably remember the 5 1/4 inch floppy disks that we used to use for computers. Very huge, massive black squares, right? And those had a very low capacity, I think 32 kilobytes per side. Now, the Mitsumi Quick Disk is a little closer to a 3.5 inch floppy, which if you grew up in the 90s, you'll probably remember those because we'd have to save all of our homework on them. Well, most of our homework, right? And those disks had 1.44 megabytes of storage. The quick disks, or the modified quick disks for the Famicom, had 112 kilobytes, 64 per side. So that's a big limitation, and we talked about before how the Famicom could read up to a megabyte, maybe even more, and a cartridge could just keep putting more and more ROM chips on the cartridge as much as you needed to fit the game that you're putting on the cartridge. The quick disks, they had a hard limit of that 112 kilobytes, and nothing to expand on more than that, which was a huge, hard limit. Just like how you would have all those memory chips, all those ROM chips on the cartridges, you had a limited number of ROM chips in the RAM adapter that came with the Famicom Disk System, and it couldn't be expanded. So I think that's one of the reasons why it didn't work out. Another really kind of nifty thing about the Famicom discs is they had a Nintendo logo die cut into the disc, and that was actually a part of DRM. If a disc didn't have those, it wouldn't be able to go into the disk system. It was keyed specifically so that it lined up with the Nintendo logo that was inside the system. Another very cool little factoid about the disk system. Now, the FDS is not very good at reading disks. Most disk drives have 2 motors, one that spins the disk and another that tracks the disk. That's how it could read the disks quickly. But the Famicom Disk System couldn't do both of these things at the same time. Every time a disk was loaded or flipped, it had to read the entire disk, which takes about 7 seconds. Which doesn't sound that long, but when you're trying to play a game, it's a really long time. Every time you put a game into the FDS, you would have to go to the load screen, press start, remove the disk, turn it over, reinsert it, and then wait 7 seconds for the game to load. That 7 seconds is a really long 7 seconds when you're trying to play a game. So in spite of those limitations though, there were some really cool benefits to the disk system, and that's where things get really interesting and what I'm really excited to talk to you about today. First of all, the discs were writable, and this was a revelation in console gaming in the 1980s. Cartridge games could not save games. Now I know what you're going to say. You're going to say, whoa, but I played Legend of Zelda on my NES in a cartridge, and I was able to save my game. And that's absolutely right, you were. Because after a little while, the geniuses at Nintendo figured out that if they took a volatile SRAM chip, which is a kind of memory that once the system is turned off would normally vanish forever, and back that up with a battery, that would save that data indefinitely. And if you're a vintage game collector and you've had some of these older games with the batteries, then you know that after a while those batteries do die, and when they do, all that data that was saved on that SRAM chip is gone. Whereas with the disk, it's there until you write over it. So obviously the SRAM caught on in a big way after that, only because the disk system failed, even though it really is not as good a method of storing your games, but those batteries had a life of like 25 years. So only now those old cartridges are stopping saving games at this point. It was a new capability, and it made huge world-building games possible. We didn't have world-building games like this, especially not on consoles, and at the time home computers weren't robust enough to make these. I think there were some big role-playing games like that for home computers, but nothing like that on a living room console like we were able to see here with the disk system. Legend of Zelda would not be possible without the disk system and the save function. Not only were the disks writable, they were overwritable. This is the coolest part. You could take a disk system game, maybe you don't like the game that much, or you've just played it out and you're done with it. Take it to a kiosk in a game store in Japan in 1986, buy a new game and write it onto the same disk. Now, I was trying to find some information about how much it cost to purchase a game through a kiosk and write it to a disk. I was not able to find that pricing information anywhere. If you have that, I would absolutely love you to share that with me in the comments and let me know, and of course I'll credit you in another video if you do give me that information. The discs themselves, I'll talk about the pricing on the discs themselves shortly. Those kiosks were amazing though, because not only could you buy new games and overwrite your games there, you could upload your high scores to national leaderboards. And there were even contests, and you could take those discs to the store, put them into the system, into the kiosk, upload your score, and possibly win a prize. So that's something that's really, really cool. Finally, touched on this point a moment ago, the discs were much cheaper. Cartridge games apparently, now this pricing variance was really bizarre to me, but as I was looking online to find out more about this, I saw that you could buy a cartridge game in Japan anywhere from 2,500 yen up to as much as 8,900 yen, which I found really, really fascinating, because that's a huge variance in price. But the disk system games were all under 3,000 yen, which was around $17 USD. If you think about that, in the 80s, your NES games that you bought retail were about 40 bucks. So you got to figure, I think maybe 30. So you got to figure like half the price, a little bit more than half the price for a game on a Famicom Disk System disc, which made it worth the cost of the peripheral. The peripheral itself was about $80 USD at the time. Now we talked a little bit about the storage on the discs, and I want to kind of come back to that point because we talked a little bit about how the storage on cartridges was basically unlimited, and not really unlimited, but you could put as many ROM chips on the cartridge as you felt you needed to get your game on there, up to a point, as much as the Famicom's processor could handle. And again, I want to deep dive into that. With a cartridge, you're basically putting an expansion card into an expansion slot. Now, if you know a bit about microcomputers, then you know that expansion slots have an incredible amount of versatility. There's a lot you can do with them. The games weren't really software, they were basically firmware that was slotted into the system, kind of like when you install RAM into your computer at home. So when you think about that, there's a lot of possibilities of what you could do on those cartridges, and we saw a lot of that later on with the Super NES and the Super Famicom with the Super FX chip and things like that. A lot of games, in fact, in that generation on the Super NES had a lot of extra power on the cartridges. In fact, we'll get into that in a Super NES video, but the Super NES hardware itself wasn't even all that robust. A lot of hardware lived on the cartridges. Really, really interesting. So it gives you some insight into what the cartridges are capable of. The disk system had a hard limit because the RAM adapter only had so much memory on it, which was a real shame. Now, there are a few games we're going to look at. Before we get there, within 2 years, the Famicom Disk System disappeared and never made it to the US for a number of reasons. The main one is that Nintendo just had far too much control over that peripheral. It was much too expensive for third parties to create games for it. It was just cheaper for them to make cartridge games, and once they started making the battery save games, it just didn't make sense to make these games anymore, especially given that the technical limitations of the disk system really hamstringed their ability to make games. Most games have more memory than the disk system was capable of handling, so it just didn't make sense to keep on trying to use it. But it did give us some real important footnotes in the history of gaming. Legend of Zelda and the definitive version of Metroid for sure, as well as Kid Icarus, and Castlevania 1 and 2 with some interesting features that you're not going to find on the US version. But the most interesting thing, the most interesting story about the Famicom Disk System is the story of Super Mario Bros. 2. We're going to talk about that in part 2 of this episode because it's getting a bit long, and I want to make sure that we have plenty of time to cover Super Mario Bros. 2. Now, some of the differences are pretty subtle. There are two main ones that you're going to find the trend with: a save feature and better music. So Castlevania 1 and 2, Akumajo Dracula in Japan, or Akumajo Dracula in Japan, and Akumajo Dracula Simon no Senshi, or Simon no, I don't know, Simon's Quest, Quest of Simon, Questu no Simon, they have a save feature. So in Castlevania, that's amazing because that's such a hard game, and for us as kids in the US, we would just have to start the game over again every time we wanted to play. Whereas in the disk system version, you could finally defeat that boss, finally beat the mummy, and get to the next level and save that progress so you don't have to play the whole game all over again every time. Probably saved a lot of frustration for the young gamers in Japan at the time. But Simon's Quest, a save feature in Simon's Quest, wouldn't that be amazing to have had that in the US version, instead of those big, long, clunky, difficult passwords that were, what, 60 characters or something ridiculous like that? I don't even know. I don't have it in front of me. A lot of characters. Really cool feature. One thing I did notice while I was playing the games and comparing them, the US version of Castlevania seems to have a lot less screen flicker. This is pretty common in these older games. There's just flickering on the screen, and the flickering of the on-screen images comes from just the hardware limitations of trying to process all that video data and having a bottleneck in the CPU where it just couldn't process the data fast enough. So you have the screen flicker where the on-screen images, every other frame, actually disappear. Which on the disk system version, I actually didn't see that happening quite so much. I don't have a technical explanation of why that was. Maybe it kept on writing back to the disk or something, I'm not too sure. So pretty interesting little difference. And Castlevania is one of my favorite franchises of all time. So in a future video, I'll definitely be talking a lot more about Castlevania. The extra waveform channel though makes a huge difference in games. I want you to go ahead and take a listen to a little bit of Castlevania 1 and 2, NES versus Famicom Disk System. Check it out. Now, what really hurt these games was long load times between screens, especially in Simon's Quest, and having to flip the disc over between levels, especially in Castlevania 1. That 7-second load time, you finish level 1, then you have to flip the disc and wait 7 seconds for level 2 to load. Really makes things very tedious. Probably made the save feature a lot more coming in handy too, because you didn't have to do that every single time. But that really definitely hurt the game experience for me quite a lot. Now, Pro Wrestle, the Japanese version of Pro Wrestling, has unique start screen music. The US version shares the same start screen music with all three games in the sports series of NES launch titles, whereas the Japanese version does have its own intro music, which is very cool. And the audio channel makes it sound much nicer on the Famicom Disk System. And I feel like it plays a little bit better too. Check it out. sure, the FDS version of Metroid is the definitive version because you can save your progress. Just like we were talking about before with Castlevania 2, this is such a huge boon for you if you're playing the Famicom Disk System version of Metroid instead of dealing with those annoying passwords. Today we have emulation, and you can save your state, which that didn't exist at the time. So playing Metroid with the ability to save your progress is absolutely fantastic. There's a little bit more slowdown on the disk system version, and I think that kind of ties into what we were talking about before with the hardware limits of the disk system. It didn't have as much memory, so I think it had to cache and uncache rather rapidly, which caused some slowdown at certain parts of the game. But that audio channel, again, really makes a big difference in the sound. That's my favorite thing about the disk system. If you want to check it out, give it a listen. And that brings us to The Legend of Zelda. By the time The Legend of Zelda came to the West, Nintendo had begun to place those battery-backed SRAM chips in the cartridges that we talked about before. So here in the US, we could save our game of Legend of Zelda. But, but, if it weren't for that saving innovation on the disk system, we may never have gotten Legend of Zelda at all. It wasn't possible to make a game like that until they figured out a way to save your game. There's one other really cool difference with Zelda for the FDS, apart from the music being a little nicer. Controller 2 on the Famicom Disk System has a microphone. And to defeat the Pulse Voice enemy, you have to yell into the microphone on Controller 2. Really, really, really cool little feature. I would love to do a playthrough of the Disk System version of Legend of Zelda, but I think that one might be an issue because I don't have a physical disk system here. I have to do it with an emulator, and I don't know if I can emulate yelling into the controller, unfortunately. Although, getting a disk system high on my list of collection priorities. One of the first things I'm going to do if this channel does well is I'm going to use whatever ad revenue I get to buy stuff to review on the channel. So I could talk about it, give some pictures. Maybe if I'm really daring, break it open and look at the insides, look at the guts. Now the most noteworthy story, for me, the most intriguing and crazy story from the Famicom Disk System is the story of Yume Kojo Doki Doki Panic. But you know that game as Super Mario Bros. 2. This is a very, very fun story, which we're going to cover in part 2 of this series, because you have just spent 23 minutes of your time with me, and I think I've asked quite enough of you. Thank you so much for listening. I know there are a lot of retro gaming channels on YouTube, so I appreciate you spending your time here with me today. If you enjoyed it, please like, subscribe, turn on notifications, throw me a comment, because your comments help my video go up, 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 and lets the algorithm maybe give it a little rub. So I thank you again for spending your time with me. Have a great day, evening, morning, night, whatever it is, wherever you are, and I'll see you next time.